It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID livestream, Series 13, Episode 5. That, adding together all my fingers and thumbs and many more digits besides, leads us to Episode 77 starts here. We're in London today and obviously organising the funeral this week of a 70-year monarch who was, by pretty much every metric, the most recognised woman on earth for several generations. Has been quite the challenge. But London lived up to the incredible excitement. For those who like their history, HRH, Queen Elizabeth II, was laid to rest yesterday after a funeral service at Westminster Abbey, marking only the first royal funeral there since George II in 1760. In other words, actually, before most of the nations represented in the cathedral, of which there were 150 something, existed in the first place. That's a handy reminder of the longevity of monarchy, not just the 70-year-long reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Westminster Abbey, 19th of September, was clearly the ultimate invitation of 2022. And meanwhile, the coronation will, I am sure, be the most sought-after invitation of 2023. Once again, in the hotbed of excitement, the multicultural global megacity, which is London. And I'm delighted to say we're here today in the Ice House. You'll remember we were here last year for an excellent show. Today, our guest is Caterina Caramaschi. We are coming of age with ICE as Caterina is celebrating her 21st anniversary working in equity derivatives with ICE, originally LIFFE. Kat was named Global Head of Equity Derivatives at ICE in December 2020. She's responsible for ICE's Global Equity Derivatives Complex, covering MSCI Index Futures, FTSE Index Futures and Options, NYSE FANG Plus Index Futures, as well as single stock futures and options. So, greetings, Kat. Today, it's a joy to have you here. I don't need to ask you where in the world you are today because I've already given that handy secret away. We're in the heart of the city of London, in the Ice House. So, gosh, Kat, we first met 21 years ago, I do believe.
Yes, 2001 when I first started. We're involved in the single stock futures launch together.
Absolutely. And what exciting times that was.
I know. Very revolutionary product. I think you were the first person to write a book on single stock futures.
I had a few different things. Yes, I remember very well because I wrote Capital Market Revolution and we sent a copy, a pre-proof copy to Brian Williamson, later Sir Brian Williamson of LIFFE, the chairman. And he rang me up from a lay-by somewhere in the middle of the north of England as he was on his way to a weekend's, I can't remember, it was hunting, shooting, fishing. And he said, I can't believe this. You're the first person to talk about single stock futures. I talk about them all day long and everyone thinks I'm bonkers. And, well, he wasn't bonkers. He had a very, very good foresight as to what the future of the world was going to be. And I think there was myself. There was definitely Richard Sander, who was a very, very early advocate of the whole concept and had been, to be fair, all the way back to when, good grief, they had the original Shad Johnson Accord in 1982. And a few other people. And of course, Hong Kong had really been the revolutionary outrider because they'd created single stock futures a few years earlier for the domestic market. I think they started with HSBC Bank. It was long before HSBC Bank even acquired the Midland in the mid-1990s. So here we were in London, and suddenly the world's largest financial center, was going to embrace single stock futures.
Absolutely. And we launched universal stock futures, as they were known back then, in, I think it was January 2001. So just before I started at LIFFE, because I started at LIFFE in February 2001.
Gosh.
So when I started, that was the new product, coming out to market. Everyone's focus was on that. I think we were a team of 5 people in the product and product development team, I'd call it. And of course, you had the marketing teams as well involved in it. So it was a huge launch. And we were the first exchange to offer not just local markets, so not just UK single stock futures, but we expanded and offered European names as well. And we started with 25 names, and we're now at close to 700 underlyings on single stock futures.
It's quite incredible, actually, when you think about that macro point. We'll get back to history in a second, but you look at how even in 2001, 2002, there was this general belief that we're pushing the envelope of how many underlying shares can have futures or options beneath them.
Yeah.
And you think about it today, and I mean, in those days, there was barely, I think, 65 or 70 shares in single name shares in London, plus the indexes and so on. And you look today and it's incredible, the cornucopia of product.
Absolutely. I mean, when I first started, as you said, we had about 60 UK single stock options, 25, I think we launched on the single stock futures. And then we had, a basket of FTSE products, but really the 100 was what was really trading. And fast forward to today, not just on ICE, but across the globe, the amount of underlyings that you can list single stock futures and options on is vast.
Yeah.
On ICE, when we migrated from LIFFE to ICE, we were covering emerging markets and developed markets on the single names.
Yes.
So yeah, huge development.
It's funny because I remember some of the hilarious things that were going on at that point in time. I seem to remember a particular French PLC, and I won't name them because it's many generations since, whose chief treasurer was writing very rude letters to Nick Carew-Hunt at LIFFE saying, zut alors, you cannot possibly expect to list these things. We are French. You cannot steal our intellectual property of our stock, and other things which one might suspect had been perhaps drafted by some people in Rue Cambon at the time. Possibly. But of course, that all changed because although you've never moved company, you've had a multiplicity of different employers.
Yes, absolutely. So we, as LIFFE, then we had the Euronext takeover, then we had the NYSE takeover. And speaking of going down, memory lane.
Oh my goodness.
We've got the famous LIFFE
30th anniversary.
Yes.
Gosh.
Yes.
If I'd known, I could have won my 25th anniversary cufflinks if I thought about it. Didn't get. Unfortunately for today, we're still mourning the Queen, ladies and gentlemen.
Absolutely.
So therefore, I've got my Union Jack Mini Coopers with me today. So on behalf of Her Majesty's passing. Oh, how wonderful! So we've got a full 30 years spread of the exchange and all of the things which were going on. So let's have let's have a look at this. This is magnificent. I'm going to blot out probably Kat's lovely features here in order to show you. That's the hotbed of the pits in their heyday.
Yeah.
And that's at Cannon Bridge.
That was a Cannon Bridge. Unfortunately, I just missed the pits. So when I joined, we had gone fully electronic.
Quite incredible. I can see lots of interesting different mnemonics and badges there. You've got Union Discount Company. I can see. I do believe we've got Babcock's and Tullett somewhere there in the background. Gosh, all sorts of different exciting companies, and indeed the locals of Kite Futures we can see here. Oh, that's a marvelous book altogether. It's fantastic. It's like Jackanory meets Blue Peter today, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you of a sufficient age in the United Kingdom. But it's lovely to see, and such an amazing history. And of course, we cannot forget that 30 years ago, just a little over 30 years ago, Her Majesty the Queen visited the LIFFE floor as well, which was in 1992, which I remember the day very, very well. There she is, Her Majesty, visiting the LIFFE floor, being introduced to various directors and different parties. It was a great day altogether. The floor was so excited that day. Nobody wanted to go home early, even though trading wasn't that exciting, because everybody wanted to stay and meet the Queen. And she had 3,000 cheering traders on the floor that day. I think there were more people on the floor than were actually accredited most days in the pits. I think everyone who had a badge had turned up on that day in order to manage to be there. So it's incredible history. So then we get to, so soon, I mean, not that long after you join LIFFE, and you suddenly find that you're going to be part of Euronext LIFFE.
Euronext LIFFE, absolutely. So Euronext LIFFE took us over in 2002, so just under a year after I joined. And then, of course, you had the Euronext derivatives franchise merging with the LIFFE equity derivatives franchise. They also had a fixed income franchise as well. And we stayed Euronext LIFFE for several years. And during that time, when we were part of Euronext LIFFE, we launched several new sort of platforms. We had Match.
Yes, I remember Match. Yes, single stock futures. Yes,
absolutely. And then that sort of developed. Again, why did we do all those things? Is to try and I think we're very, very innovative for our time. Was we looked at the OTC markets and said, well, how can we bring this OTC business on exchange?
Yes.
And so we came up with various different platforms. We had Match, we had an OTC service, which the name escapes me at the moment. I think we only called it OTC service. And then eventually we sort of put all that together and we came up with BeClear.
Yes.
And BeClear became such a strong brand that we used to go into meetings with clients and they would say, do you work for LIFFE or do you work for BeClear? It's like, no, BeClear is part of LIFFE. So yeah, BeClear was a sort of wholesale trading facility which gave clients the flexibility to trade anything really, single stocks, index futures, but you could trade daily expiries, you could trade cash or physically delivered. So very innovative for its time.
It was very innovative for its time, and it also dovetailed neatly because particularly led by a lot of French banks, as I remember. I mean, Societe Generale and people like that, they'd been quoting all sorts of options, warrants and related derivatives products for many years. You could get them by looking at Bloomberg or Reuters pages, but they were closed to only certain institutional counterparties. But other institutional counterparties weren't happy because they didn't have an organized facility. And then you were linking straight into the clearinghouse, which at that stage you were linking into LCH because that predates the, as it is now, ICE clearinghouse.
Absolutely. So yeah, we basically, you're absolutely right. It was a clearing facility.
Yes.
We're basically saying, bring your business to BeClear and we will clear it for you. And so that was really welcomed by the markets. BeClear did very well. And, you know, considering this was back in 2005, we were offering daily expiries, cash to physically delivered, you know, things where I think our peers now are saying, hey, we're revolutionizing the equity derivatives market by giving you flex expiries. We were doing that back in 2005.
Absolutely.
You know, you choose whatever strike you want, you choose whatever expiry date you want, you can cash settle, you can physically deliver it on the single names. So yeah, we've been doing that for decades.
Yes, it's quite incredible. And also what I think is very interesting is that on one side of the banks and financial institutions, they were going, we love this because it organizes all our trading straight into a clearinghouse and we feel absolutely safe. And that was at the same time when a certain group of particularly AAA banks would have all said, well, you're not doing that with interest rates because anarchy will go that way. And instead they developed their own sense of anarchy and look where we ended up, which is a totally different story. But yeah, very, very interesting. The innovative process, I mean, all the way from really 1992 when the original LIFFE LTOM, London Traded Options Market merger took place, when briefly they were going to call the LIFFE exchange LDX, the London Derivatives Exchange, which a lot of people have forgotten about. Somebody won a bottle of champagne for predicting that, actually, at that point in time. And ultimately, that was it. They were the only person who ever made any money out of it, I think, because they got a bottle of champagne, because it was subsequently died a death because everyone, oh, LIFFE. Why do we want to rename LIFFE LDX? I mean, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like some pharmaceutical product or something. Agricultural activity with LDX sounds much more sensible. So it's amazing. I mean, we're talking about the coming of age with ICE, not just your career over 21 years, but also the development of the derivatives market. So you go through this interesting Euronext phase, and it became very exciting because LIFFE was at the epicenter. And let's face it, I mean, actually, the Paris Matif and Monep had been hugely successful domestic derivatives markets in many ways. And you also then had the Amsterdam market, which had been the original European options market for single stock names just months ahead of LTOM in the 1970s. Then, of course, you get another corporate upheaval just as you're managing to get used to that one.
Yes, then we move on, and the NYSE and Euronext LIFFE merge because mergers of equals.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's a great phrase, merger of equals. It covers a lot of things. Like, yes, I think the The most politically incorrect description of merger of equals was when they asked a German correspondent many years ago about a telecoms merger, and they said they're holding this a merger of equals, to which she replied, well, they said that about Austria and Germany in 1938. But we wouldn't possibly say anything so politically incorrect on a show like this, ladies and gentlemen, and we're certainly not eschewing that as being the corporate policy or belief of Intercontinental Exchange. That's just a personal comment in history, but it's certainly, yes, there was a merger of equals, which meant that the Americans ran everything, and everybody else got to be sort of distinctly somewhere else in the hierarchy. But nonetheless, it was a very exciting time for the LIFFE exchange, because of course LIFFE had a couple of stabs at going transatlantic in the past, hadn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So we had the NQLX
with NASDAQ.
With NASDAQ, absolutely. So yeah, then being part of the NYSE brand, if you like, just opened up the US for us. And then you had the NYSE Life Exchange, NYSE Life US Exchange being born. And from an equity derivatives franchise, that was when we got into the MSCI Index Futures space.
Right.
So that was very exciting times, because when we got into the MSCI Index Futures space, the MSCI derivatives market was tiny.
Yes.
Nobody spoke about MSCI derivatives. So very innovative from the NYSE Life group. And we still have Lynn Martin here.
Yes.
Pioneer.
Lynn Martin. Hello, Lynn Martin. Good to see you. We bow in your general direction on Wall Street, Lynn Martin, not just because you used to be also on this show in lesser times, but also before your elevation to president of the NYSE.
She's the
fantastic, isn't it? Wonderful. It's great to see.
Absolutely brilliant. I'm so pleased for her and very deserved of it. So yeah, Lynn was instrumental in the NYSE Life US moving into the MSCI space. I remember we had 2 MSCI futures contracts, which were there pre me joining.
Yes.
The Pan-Euro and the Euro.
Yes.
So we migrated those 2 contracts over to the US so that we have everything in the US. And then we won the license for the EM and the IFA, MSCI EM and IFA. And so those contracts migrated to NYSE Life US. I think we had about 30 to 40,000 lots of open interest at the time. And fast forward to now, I mean, we've got close to 2 million lots of open interest across our, mainly concentrated on the EM and IFA, because our MSCI EM and IFA now are ranked in the top 10 index futures globally.
And EM and IFA are, for the benefit of those who may not be up with all their indexes?
MSCI EM is the MSCI Emerging Markets Index Futures, and the MSCI IFA is basically developed markets excluding North America.
Okay, so IFA's developed markets excluding North America, which is very interesting. So therefore, it's good grief. I mean, it's a realm of 25,000-30,000 shares being represented by that basket. And then the Emerging Markets Index, how many stocks are in that?
It's about 1,000 something stocks,
good
mainly
grief.
heavy China weighting, so it's around 40% China weighting. And then you've got the other EM countries like India, like Taiwan. So very heavily traded index future, very liquid. We've got central order book, very liquid central order book, very developed central order book. And very good, strong open interest in that one. It's our biggest MSCI future, ours and the biggest MSCI future globally.
It's quite incredible. The reason I'm giggling, ladies and gentlemen, is because I can actually remember the days. I mean, the idea of calculating indexes in real time on 1,000+ stocks is just mind-boggling for a lot of us, because when I started, I can remember they were still only calculating the FTSE 100 1 minute to the next minute, which actually led various parties to have the excitement of looking for there used to be a big screen and every stock was on it, the 100 of the FTSE index, and we would watch it in the futures or the options. And if you saw lots of red, you'd be trying to sell as fast as possible to work out what was going on. But of course, the problem was that not everything had the same beta value. So sometimes BP might go green and that would wipe out what 10 or 12 of the other stocks were doing. But that was minute to minute living as we waited for the new index to come along. And that was only 100 stocks. And now we're talking about, the ease of calculation, which again, is thanks also to Lynn Martin and her team of boffins, because they did so much work on making sure that this stuff goes through. And it is fascinating, as you say, that MSCI as a company really wasn't used for so long, probably because their indexes were actually quite complex, as opposed to be fair to, say, FTSE or S&P, they had a lot of very headline-grabbing indexes that weren't necessarily that complex, weren't that difficult. They were single feeds. I mean, the MSCI must be quite tricky because you're taking feeds in from so many different places.
I know, and I mean, the country coverage, MSCI has the ACWI index, which is the old country world index. They have obviously the IFA, they have emerging markets, and they also go into frontier markets. So, I mean, their coverage is vast, and which means, a lot of asset owners are benchmarked to MSCI products. And historically, a lot of these asset owners would look for proxies in the derivatives world and say, well, this is highly correlated to that. It's liquid enough, so I'll use that to trade or to, for my hedging. But now that the MSCI derivatives business has developed, people can use the exact derivative product that they're benchmarked to. So EM, brilliant that, NYSE Life US got into that space at that point, because it just, if you look at open interest, and I can share this with you later, it's just upward sloping, and it continues to develop as well.
But therein, I mean, is something fascinating. We still haven't got through all of the owners of your wondrous franchise and your employers over time yet. But you look at the whole way the macro has developed. I mean, we mentioned this earlier, 20 years ago when you started, people thought the known universe was going to be a very, very modest number of people. It reminds me all of it. What was that great comment about Daimler-Benz originally said the world market for cars was about 10 to 12,000, because that was the number of carriage drivers who could be retrained as chauffeurs, which always reminds me of the options futures world, because you look at now, I mean, good grief, how many roughly, I mean, there's 4,000 or 5,000 traded options available throughout the world quite easily on single name stocks, if not more.
Easily.
It's just incredible.
Absolutely incredible. And there is a lot of overlap.
Yes.
Right. So, especially in the US market, there's definitely overlap because you've
OCC mutual clearing.
Exactly. In Europe, there is also overlap, though you don't have that mutual clearing that we have in the US. But you could trade a Deutsche Telekom option on ICE.
Yes.
On Eurex and on Euronext.
Yes.
And they all pretty much have the same contract specs. So yes, the number of options is vast.
Yes.
The number of underlying has also grown substantially, but there's a lot of overlap between the European exchanges.
But it's also incredible. I mean, that underlying liquidity growth has been sensational, because it's not just about the number of products available. The simple fact of the matter is that 20-something years ago, there were really only 5 or 10 evergreen liquid options. The rest relied on a corporate action, at which point in time, suddenly all attention was on commercial union or whatever was going on, or land securities or something like that in the UK market. And you look at it today, I mean, well, particularly in the United States of America, the depth of liquidity is scintillating.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, the growth that was seen in the US is amazing on the US option side. It's been great because we have NYSE options business. So we have 2 exchanges covering the options markets in the US. So they have seen phenomenal growth on that side. Less so in Europe. And I think it's very much the structure of the market and the structure of the users of the market. I think in Europe, and again, I'll only speak about the UK market, the use of derivatives products by the retail investors is not as high as if you compare to the US market and even the Dutch market, for example. Yes. So there is less retail participation in UK single stock options. There is some, but it's not as big proportionally as it is in the US and I would say the Netherlands as well. Several factors. I mean, in the UK, CFDs, spread betting, very popular in the retail market. I think retail really focus on that, and retail brokers focus on those products a lot more. I think there's also taxation issues in terms of how options are taxed versus spread betting and CFD. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be fixed to make retail in Europe become more option friendly, if you like, or become more users of the derivatives. And something we're definitely looking into. It's definitely a market we would like to tap into.
You know, it's very interesting because we had Stephen Sears on the show just before our summer break, and I thought that was fascinating because there you had such an interesting thing. I mean, the big news wires and news services out of America have had these options correspondents for so many years who write a great deal, and yet it has to be said in the UK and the continental European media, actually getting anybody who covers options is almost non-existent.
Non-existent. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you look at the US retail brokers, how much information they pump out to the retail users on options, it's completely different to what we have in Europe. That's not me, pointing the finger at anyone. I think it's just the structure of the market is very different. I think Europe has been much more institutionally focused, building products for institutional users as opposed to building products for the retail players.
Well, I think that's true. And I mean, that's certainly the history of the City of London, which is an institutional financial centre, which happens to bring the UK retail market with it, but it's vastly oriented in that sense. And obviously also, I mean, in the last couple of years, you had this amazing Reddit phenomenon, which took off in the USA. Now, how do you feel that's playing out now? Because obviously a lot of these people, they've got back to work after COVID, perhaps they're not so speculative. What's your sort of feeling about the way that that's impacted the market and going forward?
So I think we got to a point, mid-COVID, where it almost got dangerous, where people, I think some retail investors saw it as I'm playing a game as opposed to I'm risking money here. And yes, that helped volumes, hugely helped volumes. And I think we saw some of that leak into Europe as well. And it may not have been that they were using the UK stock options, for example. They're probably trading US stock options. So yes, it did help bring volumes, but I think there was also a danger. Were these retail participants knowing what they were trading? And knowing the risks associated with what they were trading. Because I think if you are a knowledgeable retail investor and you understand the risks, then absolutely trade options, all day. But if you don't understand the risks associated with it, it's almost this peer influence of everyone's in it, so I want to be. What is it, FOMO?
Yes,
Fear
absolutely.
FOMO,
Out, right? Total FOMO.
I've been trading stocks, but my friends are trading all these options. I want to get into it. So I think there was an element of that which was a little bit scary in the US market. But I think the silver lining of that is a lot of people started trading options and got to understand and learn a bit more.
Well, I think the other thing, I mean, the one thing that's revolutionary to me is you look at, good grief, so I'm really showing my age. I mean, I first traded London traded options, market options, I think in 1984. When I would like to point out, I was barely much beyond an embryo. And I was an early adopting embryo.
Absolutely.
I traded early, invested early. But you look at one thing which is incredible is the cost structure. I mean, my goodness, at that point in time, you would easily pay pretty much, even with a good broker, you were paying probably 1%, you're probably paying at least £20 a trade, which is therefore going to be a couple of ticks in an option, which is quite a lot because of delta. And if you don't know what delta is, go check out another YouTube video to understand delta, because it's so important. And you look at it now, and I mean, it's incredible. First of all, I applaud all the exchanges and the clearing houses, because the costs are absolutely wafer thin. I've never understood why people want to trade this cryptocurrency malarkey, given how expensive it is compared to the nickels and dimes. But you can go to a major broker, not mentioning any in particular, but any of the major American brokers, and I mean, a couple of dollars gets you an enormously long way in terms of trading an option. And that's absolutely sensational when the tick size is instantly, usually always $5, $10, $20, something like that between them. And that cost, I mean, that coming down in cost by 99% or something during the electronic age has been absolutely revolutionary as well.
Absolutely. Definitely. On the single names, trading fees have only been going in one
super
direction.
competitive, around the
Super
world.
very
Yes.
commercialized, and that begs the question, to your point, why aren't more people trading these products, which have become so much more accessible as well,
Yes.
compared to other less transparent products.
Well, certainly you look at out of the money hedging and things like that, which used to be expensive by dint of the cost of transaction. Now you can buy yourself insurance, and it's effectively costing the insurance plus a couple of bucks.
Yeah.
I mean, a little more, and that makes such a difference. I mean, you mentioned how much the overall fees have come down, and they've come down across everything. And actually, most of the squeeze, the compression's really been on the broker side as they went more electronic. But it's fascinating. So, going back to our macro overarching here, I realize we're still one name behind, because we've managed to get ourselves through the incredible emotion of whatever it was, Euronext, LIFFE, NYSE, Euronext, all of those things.
Yes. So we were LIFFE, Euronext, LIFFE, then we became NYSE Euronext, NYSE LIFFE. And then shortly after that, I think it was 2011, 2012, ICE came in and acquired us. And, as I mentioned to you earlier, when we went from LIFFE to NYSE LIFFE, the brands were being sort of merged into one, and no brand was dropped. And as I mentioned to you, there were times I'd pick up the phone and answer the phone as LIFFE, and one of the senior members of staff would say, "Wash your mouth out. We're no longer LIFFE. We're NYSE LIFFE, or we're NYSE Euronext." So very confusing time in terms of branding. But when ICE came, that was very much sorted. Yes.
Monotheistic state. Yes.
It was
the defender of the faith in futures. Mr. Sprecher arrived and imposed.
Absolutely.
ICE.
It was
Three simple
clear
letters.
you are now ICE. So there was no confusion in how you pick up the phone.
The reason I'm making a joke about that actually is because it was quite interesting at the time, because certainly I think in London, and I don't mean in the staff, I think in London amongst the user community, there was a lot of belief that ICE were going to actually have to modify their branding around LIFFE.
Yeah.
And the word came down on presumably some digital tablets rather than stone ones from Atlanta. That's it. It's ICE.
It's ICE.
And actually
Absolutely.
everybody was very shocked, because they all thought that the LIFFE brand name would carry on forever.
Yeah.
And here we are 10 years later, and actually you mentioned the word LIFFE, and now people go, what was that?
You think
or
back.
or other people are going like, well, now you're aging yourself now, because if you're talking about LIFFE, and it's a whole 2 generations of traders grew up on nothing else.
Absolutely. And I remember at the time I was like, as I mentioned, Be-Clear was a very strong brand. And I remember at the time I was like, surely we're not going to lose the Be-Clear brand. And it was like, yes, that's going to become ICE Block. And at the time it was devastating.
Yes.
But when you think back now, it makes complete sense, right? Because you have to have one brand. You have to have one face, if you like. Whereas previous to that, it was a little bit more fragmented. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I mean, suddenly you become part of this very fast-moving global powerhouse. You say farewell to some fond farewells to some friends, because from the moment that deal was done, your Parisian colleagues and so on went out the door with Euronext, and you had this very interesting appraising where different products had to be gently eased off. But you end up with a powerhouse core. I mean, in Europe, you end up with a powerhouse core, for example, in the FTSE indexes.
Correct. Yes. So we kept, as you said, a lot of my ex-colleagues are still at Euronext. So, it was very strange being part of one team within a company for them to then move on to a competing exchange. I have a lot of respect for my ex-colleagues, and I wish them well, but we kept the old LIFFE equity derivatives business, which, as you said, includes the UK single stock options and also the FTSE products. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we had NYSE LIFFE US, and that was the MSCI franchise. So what does the equity derivatives business look like today? So in London, we have the FTSE 100 futures and options, we have the FTSE 100 dividend futures, and we have the FTSE 250 futures and options. We have other FTSE products, but those are the main core products. We have single stock options, as I mentioned, 600 different underlyings of the single stock options and futures, and we also have dividend adjusted stock futures. In the US, we have the MSCI futures franchise, we have FANG, and we also more recently launched futures on some of the IDS indices. So the semiconductor index is one of them. So that's the products on ICE Futures Europe and ICE Futures US. ICE, being the unique exchange that it is, not only has exchanges in Europe and the US, but also has exchanges in Singapore. We have an exchange in Abu Dhabi. We have an exchange in the Netherlands. So we as product owners can list products on any of those exchanges.
Right.
And they could clear into the clearinghouse located in the same exchange, or they could clear on other clearinghouses. So that's the uniqueness of ICE. It has this matrix of exchanges and clearinghouses that can all work together. So as I mentioned, ICE Futures Singapore, we've got MSCI futures there as well. We've got also a future on an IDS index, which is our own in-house index provider. So far, my little world is ICE Futures Europe, ICE Futures US, and ICE Futures Singapore. Could expand further in the future, but we'll see.
But that's a very, very exciting, because I mean, you're covering the entire world. The sun's never setting on your empire. You're effectively from London time, good grief, what about 10 o'clock at night on a Sunday in London, all the way through to pretty much 10 o'clock at night on a Friday, you are trading.
Yeah, absolutely. And the good thing is my team, we're all, I would say, I'm just thinking, most of us are lifers. The people who have stayed, who are still, running the equity derivatives franchise. So we've got people based in the US, in New York and Chicago. We've got people here in London, and we've got people in Singapore. So in terms of when a client wants to contact us because they have a question, there's someone always
homogeneously somewhere.
Absolutely. There's always someone who'll pick up the phone or respond to a message. And we have to be that way because, to your point, the nature of our products.
And it's an interesting point you make, where the LIFFE brand has died, but there's still a cast of people known as the lifers.
Yes.
All the way up to the president of the New York Stock Exchange, as we were mentioning earlier. It's so interesting.
Absolutely.
And there's all of these people who identify themselves. There were also the people who were on the floor, etc. And we all end up collectively calling ourselves lifers in one way, shape, or form, which is quite an interesting thing. So I don't think of any other exchange where you've got a single kind of mnemonic extended acronym where people talk about themselves in the same way, although there are obviously a lot of people in Chicago who used to be on the floor, etc. But you don't have the same perhaps ethos as there was in the LIFFE marketplace. So I mean, looking across this vast, I mean, it really is vast. I mean, you've got multi-thousands of names of individual companies. You've got, well, actually, I mean, I'm not even sure you can calculate every single index that you have, because there are various things you can trade OTC, but you're talking hundreds upon hundreds of indices, which cover pretty much any possible outcome that you may wish to see.
Yeah, on our MSCI franchise, I mean, we've got, again, if you view MSCI's offering as a tree.
Yes.
So you start with the All Country World Index, the ACWI, and branching out of that is you've got developed markets with the MSCI World, and you've got emerging markets with the MSCI Emerging Market Index. You also have Frontier as well. If we focus just on developed and emerging markets, branching off from that, you then have the regional indices.
Right.
So EM Asia, EM EMEA, EM LATAM, and in the developed markets, you've got Europe, the Pacific, etc. We cover that whole universe.
Incredible.
So we have we have futures on about 100 different indices. We've got sector indices as well, like the world sectors, the Europe sectors, EMU sectors, and stuff like that. So on the MSCI offering, it's vast.
Right.
On the FTSE offering, we focus much more on the UK.
Okay.
That's our UK derivatives offering. We are the leaders in that. We've got pretty much all the open interest. We've got about 200 billion pounds of notional OI in the FTSE products, of course, mainly focused on the 100.
Yes.
But our focus in the past year or so is really to build the FTSE 250 index futures and options.
Right.
And we've seen great growth in the FTSE 250 futures.
And so FTSE 250 is 200.
So it's the mid-cap contracts.
Right.
So you've got the 100,
which is the biggest.
And then the 250, the next ones.
And then if you add the 100 plus the 250, you get the 350.
Correct.
There you go, masculine intuition
There
strikes again. Yes, exactly. But obviously that's very good because then you get each of those tracks back.
Yes.
I mean, I was thinking back, you were talking about, the pan-European indices, for example, that you're talking about. Well, I can actually remember being on the LIFFE floor when the very first attempt that was made, which was the Euro track, which was the mid-1990s.
Yes.
And I mean, actually the early 1990s. But that was very interesting because that was before what I might call the CNBC-ification of the marketplace. Everybody got up and they got up in their own national silo. And actually, to be fair, the European Union's MiFID didn't really, there was no ability to cross-border trade because you were paying double brokerage from one border to the next. So people weren't thinking pan-European outside the box. And you obviously had that very clever idea of the Eurotrack. What was it? Eurotrack 200, which sat alongside the FTSE 100. So therefore it ought to have run off each other, but unfortunately just never worked, which is the story of these products. I mean, let's face it, a lot of them change. Although that does raise an interesting question for me. I mean, over your coming of age with ICE, Kat, have you managed to improve the run rate of what products really work?
Yes, absolutely. So of course you have the legacy products, right? The 100, that was launched in 1984.
Exactly, yes.
Right? So those products, you continue developing them. Maybe you're tweaking here and there, you're adding new months, you're extending the expiry and stuff like that. In terms of new products, I would say, we went, as I mentioned before, we went from 25 single stock futures, 60 something single stock options and the FTSE 100, to be honest, to what we have today, which, 600 and something underlyings on the single names. We developed the FTSE 100 dividend futures. We brought the MSCIs. So, back in 2009, when we moved the MSCIs over from the CME, this was 30,000 lots of open interest.
Yes.
We're not 1.2 million lots of open interest. Yeah. So, as I said, as you rightly pointed out, there's been, across all exchanges, there's a lot of products that are launched but don't really work. Because, clients will say, this is a great idea, but clients' investment decisions change all the time, right? So you have some products which launch, they work well for a year or two, and then they move on to something else, which is fine. Because at the end of the day,
world develops.
Absolutely. And, we're here to provide tools for our clients to risk manage.
And also, of course, you've got this whole issue of cyclicity. So therefore, certain things are incredibly hot at some points in time. Absolutely. A few years ago, we could not get enough of China. Yes. Right now, everybody's kind of, well, maybe when they've sorted out the banking system and perhaps when the property bubble has sort of come to a pleasant, elegant conclusion, or even an inelegant conclusion, we'll come back. And obviously that happens. I mean, markets change across the world, so you're not going to get go-go growth and everything. In fact, the only time I can think of in my whole career we had go-go growth and everything was the middle of 2007, and that was obviously a perfect warning that the music was about to stop quite badly, because you had actually contra products all going up at the same time. Interesting. I mean, in terms of, though, looking at products, so I'm not going to ask you to opine on this, but if we take, for example, oil, the West Texas Intermediate Futures are now almost geriatric. I mean, they were introduced in 1982 when everybody had big Dallas hair, power shoulders, you name it, that's only the blokes. You move on 40 years. How do you, in the equity business, allow for the changing mores or developments of that market? Because obviously certain products in different places have been tweaked, and certain commodities, for example, have been tweaked. I mean, okay, they change perhaps delivery process and so on. At least, thank goodness for equities, it's easier because it pretty much delivers the same way it used to deliver. But What do you see as being the requirements, just at a high level, in terms of the maintenance that some of these contracts may need over time?
So, maintenance of a product can vary from changing the contract size,
Yes.
which is a big lift,
Mhm.
right, to just changing the block trade threshold.
Right.
Hey, raise the block trade threshold because we think the central order book is now developed enough to absorb that kind of volume.
Yeah.
So raise the block trade threshold slightly, and that's something you can do overnight.
Yes.
Very simple.
Yes.
So us as a team, our job is to get that feedback, and is also to make people comfortable enough to give us that feedback and feel like they can just pick up the phone to, I've got John and Carl here. Hey, have you thought about listing extra months in this product? And we as the products people sit back and think, well, can we do this from a technological perspective? And is it beneficial to the market? Big changes, you have to consult everybody, because the last thing we want is to change something which will annoy the majority of the market.
Of course.
So there's always a consultation process happening, be it formal and informal, depending on the size. In terms of, what we've done so far in terms of improving products, I think I'll use the FTSE 250 as a prime example.
Okay.
FTSE 250 futures have been there for a very long time.
Yes.
Right? But they were always sitting in the background.
Absolutely.
Nobody really asked about them. I think we had a couple of lots of open interest that would always roll every quarter, very, very consistent. I would say early last year, we're like, we need to look at the 250 products, because there was a lot of feedback we're getting that, is the 100 really a good barometer for the UK market?
Right.
Because of the constituents.
Yes.
It has very
it's
big...
an international business
Exactly.
index. I mean,
exactly.
the FTSE 100 is the City of London as opposed to the UK domestic market.
100%. Exactly. So we were getting a lot of feedback, people saying, well, the FTSE doesn't really react the way we expect it to react when there's good UK news.
Yes.
And that's just the structure of the index.
Absolutely.
So we said, well, what can we give the market, which is a better barometer of this market? And it's 250. So we invested heavily on market maker programs to build liquidity in the order book. I'm thankful to say, it's been a year we've had this program that we've been running. We're going to renew it for another year, or we have already renewed it for another year. But we're getting more firms coming in and being willing to market make the FTSE 250, which makes the end client more comfortable, because they're seeing, okay, that's a healthy order book. I'm willing to interact with that. So we've seen volumes grow in the 250 futures, which is brilliant. We've seen the spreads on the order book narrow, the size increase, and also the proportion of business that's being traded on the order book has increased compared to blocks.
Terrific.
Exactly. Pre all these changes, just over a year ago, I would say 20/80 in favor of blocks.
Wow.
I think in August we were 66% going through screen.
Right.
So huge improvement, but we continue to invest in it, get more market makers, make people more aware of the liquidity that is building. Yeah.
Fascinating talk about the futures index business and the ICE coming of age and the whole market. I'm going to ask you one question which always fascinates me. Options. Now, for instance, you talked about the Reddit phenomenon. What I'm very interested in is, if you look at Interactive Brokers, actually, who I think are an incredibly intelligent broker. I don't say that against other brokers, just there is no argument they are an incredibly intelligent broker. They used to be market makers and so on. They've come recently and effectively said you have to have at least $100,000 in an account in order to be able to have any short American expiration premium, even a call spread, which I find quite incredible, because to my mind, if you've got a call spread, well, you're basically covered. I mean, you've got 1 or 2 hours possible risk because you don't see a notification, but the world should not end in the course of time of what would happen. And actually what's going to happen to you there anyway is, if you've got a call spread, they're presumably, if you're long the call spread, they're going to exercise you on. So, I mean, most of the time it should actually cover itself with a lot of positions. So I'm just curious, do you see any particular trend in demand from customers in favor or against European expiration, which is expiration, for everybody who needs to know, expiration at one point in time on effectively the death of the contract, or American, where you can expire all of the way through the life of the contract?
So we, on the single stock options business, we offer both.
Right.
Again, under ICE block, because we give you that flexibility. I would say in single stock options, it's still very American style.
Yes.
Focused, heavy.
Yeah.
On the index products, it's different. It's all European style,
right.
The index options. And I remember back in the days, we used to offer an American style FTSE options.
Yes, I remember those.
Remember. Yeah. So that was delisted. We did offer it as a flex product on, at the time, Be Clear, now ICE block, but it never really gained any traction. So I think we're all creatures of habit, right? On the index futures side, and again, I can speak about the European market because that's where we have the index options. We don't have index options on ICE Futures US. I think there's still a preference for the European style exercise. On the single stock options, yes, on the flex products, we do see some open interest in the European style exercise, but not that much.
Not that much.
People still, though you have all this flexibility and people want all this flexibility, they still trade American physical third Friday expiries.
Interesting, isn't it? Very, very interesting. So, I mean, we've been chatting for the better part of an hour now, Kat. We've been talking about the coming of age of ICE. Your fascinating career, essentially working in the same firm, but at the same point in time working under a very, very different range of management teams and so on. And we reached that point where I ask the same question every week. So I'm curious, as the author of Capital Market Revolution, whether it's within the stock index field, whether it's within the broader derivatives field, anything at all, where do you actually think the capital market revolution goes next?
I think it's really on the index space, right? It's very much a space which is currently traded heavily in the OTC market in swaps format. I think with all the change in regulations that is coming, which is making the OTC market more expensive to trade versus on exchange, I think there is a bigger pie to go after in this OTC market to bring it on exchange. And that will benefit everybody. It'll benefit transparency. It's going to benefit the clients, because when you bring stuff on exchange, it becomes commercialized, it should reduce the costs, and it benefits ICE at the end of the day.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, Kat Caramaschi, thank you so much. Ultimately, what we're looking at once again, ladies and gentlemen, is this is the age of the exchange. We're sitting here in the ICE House, home of the Intercontinental Exchange in Europe, with their global derivatives dervish, Kat Caramaschi, who's been with the organization for 21 years through the whole history of life and so on. I think it's fascinating. We've looked at the way that costs have come down, the liquidity that has increased, the Reddit era, the division of so many indexes, where we've seen subdivision of indexes, creation of new indexes, and the possibility that you can have 1,000+ constituent indexes being charged and priced in real time, with all of the underlying constituents coming from all of the different exchanges around the world. That, to me, is absolutely fascinating. You can catch our most recent podcast, which was with Jonathan Block. We were discussing how to disrupt exchange data internationally, which was a fascinating topic. And indeed, in next week's IPO-VID, we are going to have a fabulous guest. We're going to be going to Johannesburg in South Africa, to the Sandton area of that great city. We're going to be looking at A2X, a market for all, with Kevin Brady. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, until next week at the same time, in the same place, live on Facebook, YouTube, and of course, LinkedIn. My name is Patrick L. Young. I want to say thank you very much to our wonderful hosts at ICE. Thanks to our guest, Kat Caramaschi, and we're looking forward to continuing the incredible derivatives options revolution the world over with ICE and the other great exchanges on the world, because this, ladies and gentlemen, is the world of exchanges. And in many respects, I can end this by saying, this is your life.